Imagine a sensation. Not of pain, not in the way you think of it. Not a sharp cut or a blunt impact. This is something more primal. It begins with pressure. A cloth, damp and heavy, is stretched across your face. Covers your eyes, your nose, your mouth. You are in darkness, but it's a suffocating kind of darkness. You're tilted backward, your head lower than your feet. A position that feels unnatural, vulnerable. Then comes the water. It's not a violent splash. It's a steady, relentless pour. At first, it just soaks the cloth, making it heavier, colder. You can feel it conforming to the contours of your face, sealing itself into the hollows of your eyes, pressing against your lips. You try to breathe through your mouth, but the wet fabric is sucked inward, a gag that you cannot spit out. Your only option is your nose. You take a desperate, ragged breath, but the water is still pouring. And then it happens. The water finds its way into your nostrils. It's a trickle at first, then a stream. It's not like getting water up your nose at a swimming pool. This is a deliberate, controlled invasion. The water fills your sinuses, a burning, searing pressure behind your eyes. Your lungs scream for air, but there is none to be had. There is only water. Your primal, reptilian brain takes over. The gag reflex, that violent, uncontrollable spasm in the back of your throat designed to prevent you from choking, kicks in. Your whole body convulses. You heave and gasp, but you are only inhaling more water. You are drowning, but you will not die. Just as your lungs reach their absolute breaking point, just as the blackness at the edge of your vision begins to close in, the pouring stops. You are tilted upright. You vomit water, mucus, and bile. You cough until your ribs ache, gasping for air that feels like fire in your waterlogged lungs. And in that moment of desperate, agonizing relief, a voice cuts through the ringing in your ears. Are you ready to talk? This isn't a scene from a medieval dungeon or a forgotten horror story. This is the clinical, chilling reality of a technique that has haunted the shadows of modern history. This is waterboarding. For many, the word itself conjures a very specific image. A grainy photo from a far-off war, a hushed debate on a 24-hour news channel, a line of dialogue in a spy thriller. It feels both ancient and disturbingly new. It's a practice that has been condemned as torture for centuries, used by some of history's most reviled regimes. And yet, in the 21st century, in the age of smartphones and space exploration, it re-emerged from the shadows, cloaked in new language and justified by new fears. It was no longer called torture. It was an enhanced interrogation technique. It wasn't a barbaric punishment. It was a necessary tool. Welcome to our exploration into the dark and deeply unsettling history of waterboarding. Tonight, we are not just going to look at the mechanics of this act. We are going to peel back the layers of history, law, and psychology that allowed this controversial punishment to be reborn in modern times. How did a technique prosecuted as a war crime by the United States itself after World War II become a sanctioned, presidentially approved program in the so-called War on Terror? What does the story of modern torture tell us about the line between security and barbarism? And what happens to a society when it decides that, in order to protect its values, it must abandon them? This is a story of fear, of legal loopholes, and of the terrifying human capacity to rationalize the unspeakable. It's a journey that will take us from the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition, to the jungles of the Philippines, to the secret black sites of the CIA. So take a deep breath while you still can. We're about to dive in. To truly understand the modern controversy surrounding waterboarding, we must first accept a difficult truth. It is not new. Its roots run deep into the soil of human cruelty. The concept of using water to inflict suffering and extract confessions is as simple as it is brutal, and it has appeared independently across cultures and centuries, a dark testament to a shared human imagination for inflicting pain. One of its most infamous early incarnations comes from the period of the Spanish Inquisition. Beginning in the late 15th century, the Inquisition was a tribunal established to enforce Catholic orthodoxy. Heretics, apostates, and those suspected of witchcraft were brought before inquisitors, and if they would not confess their sins, they were subjected to a variety of torments designed to purify the soul by breaking the body. Among these was a method they called the taca. The victim would be tied to a rack or a ladder, often with their head lower than their feet. A linen cloth, the taca, was forced into their mouth and down their throat. Then water would be slowly poured from a jar or jarra onto the cloth. The cloth would carry the water into the victim's throat, filling their stomach and lungs, creating the sensation of drowning. The records of the Inquisition are filled with chillingly bureaucratic descriptions of these sessions, noting how many jarras of water were used before a confession was finally obtained. This water cure, as it came to be known, was not confined to Spain. The Dutch East India Company, a symbol of mercantile power in the 17th century, used a nearly identical method to torture English traders in the infamous Amboina massacre of 1623, accusing them of treason. The French used it during their colonial wars. It became a recognized, if reviled, form of European torture. But the most critical chapter in its pre-modern history, the one that sets the stage for the profound hypocrisy of the 21st century, took place under the American flag. At the turn of the 20th century, following the Spanish-American War, the United States found itself in control of the Philippines. What began as a war of liberation from Spain quickly morphed into a brutal counterinsurgency against Filipino nationalists who wanted true independence, not a new colonial master. In the unfamiliar jungles, facing a determined guerrilla force, American soldiers began to adopt the old Spanish technique they had heard about. They called it the water cure. Letters home from soldiers and reports from early investigative journalists described the practice in graphic detail. A Filipino insurgent, or sometimes just a local villager suspected of hiding information, would be held down and water, often dirty, brackish water from a nearby stream, would be forced down their throat until their stomach was distended like a drum. Then, an American soldier might jump on their stomach, forcing the water out in a violent rush, before starting the process all over again. When these reports reached the American public, the reaction was one of shock and outrage. This was not what America was supposed to be. Figures like Mark Twain and other anti-imperialists wrote scathing condemnations. This was the barbarism of the old world, something America was meant to stand against. The controversy grew so large that it resulted in a series of Senate hearings in 1902. High-ranking officers were forced to testify. The practice was officially condemned, and several soldiers and officers were court-martialed for their use of the water cure. The message was clear. This was an illegal, immoral act, a stain on the honor of the U.S. military. This wasn't a controversial punishment. It was a crime. This precedent was solidified just a few decades later, during the aftermath of World War II. The world was reeling from the atrocities committed by the Axis powers. In the war crimes tribunals that followed in both Europe and the Pacific, the United States sat in judgment. And on the list of prosecutable war crimes committed by Japanese officers, including members of the dreaded Kempeitai military police, was a familiar technique, water torture, functionally identical to waterboarding. Japanese officers who had used this method on Allied prisoners of war were tried, convicted, and in some cases executed. The United States government, in an international legal forum, had officially defined waterboarding as a form of torture so heinous it warranted the most severe punishment. Remember that. Store it away. Because that single, undeniable historical fact is what makes the next chapter of our story so profoundly disturbing. For half a century, the verdict seemed to be in. Waterboarding was a relic of a barbaric past, a tool of inquisitors, colonial armies, and fascist regimes. It was something America defined itself against. The story should have ended there, but it didn't, because while the legal and moral history was being written in public, a different kind of history was being written in secret, in the shadowy world of psychological warfare. The Cold War was a battle of ideologies, but it was also a battle for the human mind. The CIA, in its infancy, became obsessed with the concept of cracking the code of human consciousness. They were terrified by the specter of Soviet brainwashing, showcased in the show trials of captured spies who gave seemingly robotic, rehearsed confessions. This fear sparked a massive, top-secret research program, known by infamous codenames like Project MKUltra and Project Artichoke. The goal was to understand, and ultimately control, human behavior. Out of this dark crucible of research came a document that would become one of the most influential and chilling texts in the history of interrogation. The QBARC Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, first written in 1963. QBARC was a distillation of the CIA's research into coercion, and it argued something revolutionary. It suggested that crude, physical pain was often an ineffective way to get information. It could make a subject defiant, or lead them to say anything to make the pain stop, flooding the interrogator with false information. The real key, the manual argued, was psychological disintegration. The goal was to dismantle a person's sense of self, to erase their identity and replace it with a state of profound dependency and dread. The techniques were varied. Sleep deprivation, isolation, sensory deprivation, self-inflicted pain, and the manipulation of fear and phobias. The aim was to induce a state that psychologists would later call learned helplessness. This is a condition where a person, after being subjected to a stressful situation repeatedly, comes to believe that they are powerless to change it. They stop trying to resist. Their will to fight back is simply extinguished. This, QBARC argued, was the state in which a subject was most likely to become compliant and reveal their secrets. It wasn't about breaking bones. It was about breaking the spirit. Now, where does waterboarding fit into this new psychological model? For decades, it didn't, at least not as an offensive technique. In fact, its most prominent use during the latter half of the 20th century was in an entirely different context, one that adds another layer of grim irony to our story. It became a key component of the U.S. military's most elite training program, SEER, which stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. SEER School is designed to train pilots, special forces, and others at high risk of capture how to survive behind enemy lines and, crucially, how to resist interrogation and torture if they are captured. To do this, the training simulates the experience of being a prisoner of war. Trainees are subjected to brutal, realistic conditions. They are hooded, isolated, put in stress positions, sleep-deprived, and subjected to aggressive interrogations. And for a select few, the training culminates in them experiencing a controlled, simulated version of waterboarding. The purpose was inoculation. By experiencing the terror and the panic of the technique in a controlled environment, the theory went, a soldier would be better prepared to mentally resist it if it were ever used on them by an enemy. It was a tool for building resilience, not for breaking it. It was a vaccine against torture, not the disease itself. And for decades, that's where the story stood. On one hand, waterboarding was a historical war crime. On the other, it was a secret psychological theory about learned helplessness and a defensive training tool for America's toughest soldiers. These threads ran parallel, seemingly never to meet. Until they did. The catalyst was, of course, the event that shattered the 21st century's sense of security. The attacks of September 11, 2001. In the days and weeks that followed, a wave of fear and rage washed over the United States. The public, the media, and the government were united by a single, desperate demand. Find those responsible, and stop it from ever happening again. Never again became a national mantra, and deep within the corridors of power, another phrase began to be whispered, by any means necessary. The gloves, as Vice President Dick Cheney would later say, were coming off. In this climate of existential fear, the old rules seemed insufficient. The legal and moral lines that had been drawn in the past, the Geneva Conventions, the UN Convention Against Torture, America's own legal precedents, were suddenly seen by some not as foundational principles, but as dangerous obstacles. The CIA was tasked with capturing and interrogating high-level al-Qaeda suspects. They needed methods that would guarantee information, and they turned to two men who would become the chief architects of the modern American torture program, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen. Mitchell and Jessen were not seasoned CIA interrogators. They were psychologists, and their primary experience with interrogation techniques came from one place. They were former trainers for the military's SEER program. They were the men who had administered waterboarding and other harsh techniques to American soldiers to teach them how to resist. Now, in the frantic atmosphere of the post-9/11 world, they made a revolutionary and terrifying proposal. They claimed they could reverse engineer the SEER program. They could take the techniques designed to build resistance and use them to break it. They argued that the theory of learned helplessness, which had been percolating in psychological circles since the Kubark days, was the key. They could use a combination of isolation, sleep deprivation, and acute, controlled stress like waterboarding to induce a state of total psychological collapse, rendering a detainee completely compliant. It was the perfect sales pitch for a government desperate for a silver bullet. It sounded scientific. It sounded clinical. It wasn't the crude, thuggish torture of the past. It was a psychologically based program. Mitchell and Jessen were hired on a multi-million-dollar contract, and the CIA's enhanced interrogation program was born. But there was a problem: the law. International and domestic U.S. law explicitly forbids torture. The UN Convention Against Torture, which the U.S. ratified, defines torture as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining information. Waterboarding, which the U.S. had prosecuted as a war crime, seemed to fit that definition perfectly. So the law had to be changed, or rather, reinterpreted. In a series of secret legal opinions that would later become known as the Torture Memos, lawyers in the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, most notably John Yoo and Jay Bybee, set about the task of creating a legal framework for the unthinkable. They argued, in essence, that for an act to be considered torture under U.S. law, the pain inflicted had to be equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. Think about that for a moment. The government's own lawyers were arguing that unless an interrogator was literally causing a detainee's organs to fail, it wasn't torture. It was a legal loophole so vast you could drive a tank through it. The memos also argued that waterboarding wasn't intended to cause prolonged mental harm, because the moment the detainee complied, the suffering would stop. This was a clinical, semantic game, playing with words to justify an act that caused unimaginable terror and suffering. With this legal blessing, the CIA now had its permission slip. The stage was set. The psychologists had their theory, the lawyers had their justification, and the agency had its first high-value detainee. His name was Abu Zubaydah. Captured in Pakistan in March 2002, Abu Zubaydah was believed to be a top-level al-Qaeda operational planner. He was flown to a secret CIA prison, a black site, in Thailand. He was the test case. He was patient zero for the enhanced interrogation program. When he proved uncooperative with traditional interrogation methods, Mitchell and Jessen were flown in. What followed was a descent into a scientific nightmare. The details, later revealed in the landmark Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, are sickening. Abu Zubaydah was kept in total isolation, bombarded with loud music, and sleep-deprived. He was slammed against a wall. He was confined in a small, dark box for hours on end. And then they began the waterboarding. Over the course of August 2002, Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded at least 83 separate times. The sessions became so severe that at one point, he became completely unresponsive, with bubbles rising through his open, full mouth. CIA personnel on site sent frantic messages back to headquarters, expressing concern that they were going too far, that the program was a series of escalating, unproven experiments. One officer wrote that they were, quote, slowing breaking this guy down, and that he saw a train wreck coming. But the orders from headquarters were clear. Continue. And what did these 83 sessions of simulated drowning produce? According to the Senate report, nothing. It turned out the CIA's initial assessment was wrong. Abu Zubaydah was not a senior member of al-Qaeda. He was more of a logistician and a travel facilitator. The most valuable intelligence he provided to the FBI, who interrogated him first, came before the torture began. The enhanced interrogation techniques produced no new information about impending threats. They simply broke a man. But the program, now deemed a success in the eyes of its architects, was just getting started. The next major subject was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM, the self-proclaimed mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. Captured in 2003, he was subjected to the full battery of techniques. He was sleep-deprived for over a week 180 hours. And he was waterboarded, according to CIA records, an astonishing 183 times. This is where the debate over the effectiveness of this controversial punishment becomes most heated. Proponents of the program, including Vice President Cheney and CIA Director Michael Hayden, have long maintained that these interrogations, particularly of KSM, yielded critical, actionable intelligence. They claim it disrupted plots, identified operatives, and ultimately led to the location of Osama bin Laden. They argue that in the face of an enemy that doesn't play by the rules, these harsh measures, while regrettable, were both necessary and successful. They paint a picture of tough decisions made by serious people in a time of national peril, decisions that saved American lives. But this narrative has been powerfully and systematically challenged. The 6,700-page Senate Intelligence Committee report, the most comprehensive review of the program ever conducted, came to a starkly different conclusion. After reviewing millions of internal CIA documents, cables, and emails, the report concluded that the use of these techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence. In many cases, the information obtained was fabricated, as detainees, desperate to make the torture stop, simply told interrogators what they believed they wanted to hear. The report found that the CIA's own records often failed to support their claims about the program's successes. In numerous instances, the critical intelligence cited as a success of the program had actually been obtained from a detainee before they were tortured, or was available from other intelligence sources. Even within the intelligence community, there was a deep schism. Veteran FBI interrogators, like Ali Sofan, who had successfully interrogated numerous al-Qaeda suspects using traditional, rapport-building techniques, were horrified by the CIA's methods. Sofan argued that these techniques were counterproductive, that they contaminated the intelligence stream with falsehoods, and that they destroyed any chance of gaining a detainee's long-term cooperation. He famously obtained key information from Abu Zubaydah by treating him with humanity and respect in a hospital room, only to be pushed aside when Mitchell and Jessen arrived to begin the torture. So we are left with two competing realities. One is a political talking point, that modern torture, cloaked in the euphemism of enhancement, was a dirty but necessary job that kept America safe. The other, backed by a mountain of documentary evidence, is that it was a brutal, often ineffective and poorly managed program, based on flawed psychology and dubious legal reasoning, that betrayed American values for little to no tangible gain. The story of waterboarding in the 21st century is therefore a story of a profound and deliberate act of historical amnesia. It required a nation to forget that it had once prosecuted this very act as a war crime. It required its leaders to ignore the warnings of its own experienced interrogators. It required its lawyers to twist the meaning of words beyond recognition. It is the ultimate case study in how fear can warp morality, and how the demand for security can lead a nation down a very dark path. The question of whether it worked almost becomes secondary to a more fundamental one. Even if it did, what was the cost? This brings us to the heart of the matter, the ethical battlefield where the legacy of this controversial punishment is still being fought over. The debate over waterboarding isn't just about history or effectiveness. It's about philosophy. It forces us to confront the most difficult questions about who we are and what we stand for. The primary argument in favor of practices like waterboarding is almost always a version of the ticking time bomb scenario. You've heard it 1,000 times in movies and political debates. A terrorist has been captured. He knows the location of a bomb that will kill thousands of innocent people in a major city. The bomb is set to go off in a few hours. He refuses to talk. In this highly specific, dramatic scenario, is it not only permissible but morally required to use any means necessary, including torture, to get the information and save those lives? This is a utilitarian argument. Utilitarianism is an ethical framework that judges the morality of an action based on its consequences. The most ethical choice is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In the ticking time bomb scenario, the suffering of one guilty person is weighed against the lives of thousands of innocent people. The math seems simple, but philosophers and critics have pointed out that this scenario, while powerful, is a dangerous fantasy. In the real world of intelligence, you rarely, if ever, have this level of certainty. Are you 100% sure you have the right person? Are you 100% sure they have the information you need? Are you 100% sure the information they give you under duress will be accurate? As we saw in the case of Abu Zubaydah, the answer is often no. What if you torture the wrong person? What if they give you a false location to make the pain stop, sending emergency services on a wild goose chase while the real bomb detonates? The clean, simple logic of the ticking time bomb falls apart under the messy, uncertain reality of counterterrorism. Furthermore, once you open the door to torture in one exceptional case, it becomes incredibly difficult to close it again. The definition of exceptional begins to expand. First, it's a ticking bomb. Then, it's a high-value detainee. Then, it's anyone suspected of having information about future attacks. The exception becomes the rule. And this is exactly what happened. Waterboarding wasn't used once in a ticking bomb scenario. It was used hundreds of times as a standard part of a systematic program. Opposing the utilitarian view is a deontological argument. Deontology is an ethical framework that suggests certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of their consequences. From a deontological perspective, torture is not wrong because it's ineffective. It's wrong because it is a profound violation of human dignity. It treats a person as a mere object, a container of information to be broken open, rather than as a human being with inherent rights. Proponents of this view, like the late Senator John McCain, who himself was a victim of torture as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, argued that to resort to torture is to sink to the level of your enemy. It corrupts the torturer, the institution that sanctions it, and the nation that allows it. McCain argued that these practices weren't about who the prisoners were. They were about who we are. And by torturing, we become something less than ourselves. Finally, there is the pragmatic argument against waterboarding and modern torture, which moves beyond pure ethics and focuses on strategic costs. This argument, often made by military and intelligence professionals, has several key points. First, as we've discussed, it's often ineffective and produces unreliable intelligence. Second, it damages America's moral authority and international standing, making it harder to build alliances and conduct diplomacy. When the United States tortures, it loses the high ground to criticize human rights abuses in other countries. Third, it is a powerful recruitment tool for terrorist organizations. The images from Abu Ghraib and the stories of waterboarding were used in extremist propaganda to paint the U.S. as a cruel, hypocritical enemy, fueling hatred and inspiring new generations of fighters. And fourth, and perhaps most critically for the military, it endangers American troops. By using torture, the U.S. sets a precedent that invites its enemies to do the same to captured American soldiers, erasing the protections of the Geneva Conventions that were designed to protect them. In 2009, one of President Barack Obama's first acts in office was to sign an executive order banning the use of enhanced interrogation techniques and closing the CIA's black sites. He declared that the United States would once again abide by the Geneva Conventions. In 2015, a bipartisan amendment co-sponsored by Senators McCain and Dianne Feinstein was passed into law, solidifying the ban on these techniques and restricting all U.S. government interrogations to the methods outlined in the Army Field Manual. Legally, for now, the door has been closed, but the debate is far from over. In political discourse, the idea of bringing back waterboarding is still raised. The morality and effectiveness of the program are still fiercely defended by its architects and supporters. The specter of another catastrophic attack always looms, threatening to reignite the same fears that led us down this path in the first place. The history of waterboarding in modern times is a circle. It began as a practice the U.S. condemned and prosecuted. Through a complex alchemy of fear, psychological theory, and legal gymnastics, it was reborn as a tool of the American state. After a period of intense controversy and a deep examination of its failures and moral costs, it was once again condemned and outlawed. The arc of this story is a testament to the fragility of principles in the face of fear. It shows how easily a society can be convinced to trade its ideals for a promise of security, and how difficult it is to reclaim those ideals once they have been compromised. So, where does that leave us? We've journeyed through centuries of history, from the dungeons of the Inquisition to the sterile, secret rooms of the 21st century. We've seen how the definition of torture can be bent and twisted by those in power. We've grappled with the arguments for and against a practice that forces a human being to experience the agony of their own death, over and over again. The story of waterboarding is more than just a grim piece of dark history. It's a cautionary tale. It is a warning about the power of euphemism. When we stop calling torture torture, and start calling it an enhanced interrogation technique, we create a psychological distance that makes the unspeakable seem palatable. It's a warning about the danger of secrecy. The entire program was conceived, justified, and executed in the shadows, far from public scrutiny and debate, because its architects knew it could not withstand the light of day. And most of all, it is a warning about fear. Fear is a powerful primal force. It can make good people silent and powerful people ruthless. It can convince us that the old rules no longer apply, that our values are a luxury we can no longer afford. The legacy of waterboarding is a stain. It's a stain on the legal and moral reputation of the United States. But it is also a question that hangs in the air, a question for every citizen in any democracy. What is the line? What are the fundamental principles that should never be crossed, no matter the threat? Because the ticking time bomb may be a fantasy, but the threat of future attacks is real. And the temptation to reach for the simple, brutal solution will always be there. The water has, for the moment, receded. The laws are back in place, and the public consensus, for the most part, has settled on condemnation. But the memory of the flood remains. The knowledge of what we were and are capable of lingers. The question is not whether the technique of waterboarding will be remembered by history as a form of modern torture at will. The question is whether we will remember the lessons of its revival. The question is, what will we do the next time we are afraid? What line will you draw in the sand? And what would it take for the tide of fear to wash it away? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history and ethics of one of the most controversial punishments of our time. The stories we explore here are often dark and difficult, but they are essential. Understanding the shadows of our past is the only way to ensure we don't repeat them. If this exploration of the darker side of history is something you find compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. We believe that curiosity is the antidote to ignorance, and your support is what allows us to keep asking these tough questions. And now we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this complex issue? What other aspects of historical or modern torture and punishment do you think deserve a closer look? Let us know in the comments below. Your suggestions and your engagement are what fuel this community. Thank you for listening.